Welcome to the Circle WC Ranch in Texas, Bill Wilson's place, and the Wilson Combat Channel, to which we hope you'll subscribe. My name is Massad Ayoob, and I've been asked to talk to you today about the importance of de-escalation. It's quite the topic in law enforcement today, and we're seeing it in armed citizen situations as well. Classic case in point, the 2014 shooting that went to trial in the year 2022. The murder trial of Curtis Reeves. Curtis Reeves was 72 at the time of the shooting, a retired Tampa, Florida police captain. He and his wife entered a movie theater and found themselves diagonally behind a man named Chad Oulson and his wife. Oulson was a very large man, 6'4", and in his prime of life years, mid-40s. Reeves at the time was already suffering arthritis and some of the other debilitations of old age. The previews are running, not the main movie yet, and Mr. Oulson was texting on his cell phone. It apparently bothered Mr. Reeves, who asked him to turn off his phone. Mr. Oulson replied very sharply with some F-bombs that he was not going to do it, and Mr. Reeves could F off. Mr. Reeves stood up, went out and talked to the manager and complained and came back in. By that time, Mr. Oulson had stopped texting, and Mr. Reeves said, well, if you had stopped texting before, I wouldn't have had to talk to the manager, or words to that effect. This apparently was taken differently than meant, and Mr. Oulson stood up, turned, and faced Mr. Reeves. In the moments that followed, a blow was struck. Mr. Oulson grabbed the box of popcorn from Mr. Reeves's lap and threw it in his face, and there was a gunshot. What most people saw was the large movement of the popcorn spraying on the other man, and they called it the theater popcorn shooting. What had happened, according to testimony and evidence, Mr. Reeves's perception was that he had been struck in the face with a hard object. There was, in fact, a mark on his eye, and his eyeglasses had been knocked askew. And flying popcorn is not going to cause either of those things. The cell phone, the smartphone that had been in Mr. Oulson's hand, was found at Mr. Reeves's feet, consistent with having been struck in the face with it, whether he was hit with it or it was thrown at him. Mr. Reeves's testimony was he perceived himself to be struck in the head with some hard, blunt object, which certainly is deadly force. He had reacted, drew his Kel-Tec P380 from his pocket, and fired the single shot. Before that shot went through Mr. Oulson's heart, it pierced the hand of Oulson's wife, which indicated she was trying to restrain her husband. The jury found Mr. Reeves not guilty in that shooting. Now, the public saw it as popcorn shooting, and as Mr. Reeves' expert witness said on the stand, popcorn had nothing to do with it. How do things escalate like that? All of us have to remember, particularly when we're carrying a gun, we have to leave our machismo at home. As you look back, the theater had lots of empty seats in it. Either of those couples could have moved. Either of the males of those couples could have decided, I don't want to be with this person who irritates me, and simply gone to another seat. Neither did. We all have the feeling, I have a right to be here, and the instinct to stand our ground. One element of escalation is we have to avoid being what anyone could perceive as the initial aggressor. Some thought that Mr. Reeves was a busybody and asking the other man to shut off his phone was an escalation or the beginning of a conflict or an argument. Others saw it as, well, he asked him reasonably politely and the other guy started throwing F-bombs, so he's really the first aggressor. What the jury saw, based on the judge's correct instructions, was that the first man to strike the other was the initial aggressor. There was an element of disparity of force. For those not familiar with it, disparity of force means an unarmed person can be so much more likely to kill or cripple you in an unarmed assault that greater power over you becomes the equivalent of a deadly weapon and allows you, the physically weaker or more debilitated person, to resort to a per se deadly weapon, such as a firearm, to protect yourself. If we don't learn from these lessons, we're doomed to repeat them. Be polite, be overly polite. If someone says something to irritate you, whether they don't like the way you're dressed or something like that, try to ignore them. Try to throttle back the machismo. Testosterone can be a substance of abuse. One man died in that situation. Another man went through an 8-year ordeal. And nobody came out of it the way they went into it. It's worth your time to even perhaps take a course in de-escalation, if only later you can have some expert come in and say, look, I taught this person how to de-escalate. From what I'm told, their handling of themselves at the actual scene that evolved into a shooting was an attempt to de-escalate. But remember, de-escalation has two sides. We cannot reason with the unreasonable, and most of de-escalation is trying to do that. It's worth your time to study the topic, and we all have to learn the lessons from those who've suffered before us. Sometimes there are no winners in the fight, there are only degrees of losing. And I think that particular case was a classic example. I hope you'll stay with us at the Wilson Combat Channel, and I hope you'll comment. The program is set up so you can comment, and believe me, we all read your comments. And we all learn from them as surely as we learn from Wilson Combat's dedicated speakers. We'll look forward to seeing you here back again down the road.